But we're going to skip to, I don't know that it's skipping, but we're in Deuteronomy chapter 12 now. And I've told you this a few times. I want to paint this picture for you one more time. The 10 Commandments are headings. They're headings. Now, I don't mean directions. I mean they're headings. Like if I had, now this is a bad example and I should have thought more about it, but if I had a piece of paper and I had up at the top Commandment 1, and then underneath it I had a row of commandments that attached to Commandment 1, you shall have no other gods. And then in the second column I had Commandment number 2, no graven images, no idols. And then underneath that I gave you all these laws that attach themselves to law number 2. And then in column number 3, law number 3. And then in column number 4, law number 4. And all the way across, the headings are the 10 Commandments. Underneath the 10 Commandments, there were many, many other commandments that attach to each one of those. And I'm going to show you from the book of Deuteronomy as we move forward this morning some of the headings. Probably the first 5 headings, the first 5 laws in the book, and where in the book of Deuteronomy, you could go to the book of Numbers, the book of Leviticus, and find even more laws. But in the book of Deuteronomy, you'll see how Moses breaks this down. How the 10 Commandments are the headings, but underneath thou shalt not murder, there was a lot to say. Underneath thou shalt not covet, there was a lot to say. Underneath honor your mother and your father, God had a lot to say. But the heading, the title, the theme of that law, it was given in the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments are an umbrella. And out from that umbrella goes 613 commandments. So this is where we are in the book of Deuteronomy. I don't want you to study this too hard, but you can know that there are 4 basic sections in the book of Deuteronomy, and we're in this section right here, or that's where we were. That's the wrong box. We're in B now. So in Deuteronomy 4, all the way to chapter 11, we saw the general meaning of the covenant. And now in chapter 12, we're going to see specific requirements of the covenant. The covenant, the Mosaic law, the agreement between God, I will be your God, and you will be my people. The arrangement, good morning y'all, the arrangement between God and His people Israel. So specific requirements of the covenant with some adaptations to the Exodus law. All that means is when Moses gave the law, when God gave the law at Mount Sinai, there were some very slight, very, very minor changes made 40 years later, now that God's given the law again through Moses to this second generation. So we're in the B section there, not in the A section. We're in the B section here. So let's move into this. In Exodus chapter 20, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you from Exodus, from the 10 Commandments, what the law was. And then I'm going to show you from Deuteronomy where you can find the column that goes underneath the law. So it'll make more sense as we go. This is the first commandment. The 10 commandments, the 10 words, literally in the Hebrew, the word command, mitzvah is not there. It's the 10 words. Dabar is the word. It's words, the 10 words. And in Exodus chapter 20, this is where the Jews are at Mount Sinai. This is where Moses goes up the mountain, up Mount Sinai. God calls Moses tells Moses to call all of Israel together at the base of the mountain. And God comes down onto the mountain in fire, lightnings, etc. And God speaks audibly. This would have been a fantastic day to be a human being. One day we'll hear the voice of God. None of us have heard it. But at Mount Sinai, 2 million Jews heard the voice of Almighty God as He spoke the 10 Commandments to all these people. I would love to hear His voice. Is it James? What's his name? James Earl Jones, the big, deep Darth Vader voice. You have all these voices in your head of what is it? A low, thundering voice? Yes, I would imagine that it is. I can't wait to hear it. I can't wait for my ears to vibrate the sound of the voice that God chooses. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, God gives the first commandment to Israel. And this is what He says, I am Yahweh Elohim. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And here's the command after He introduces Himself, you shall have no other gods before me. Before me means either in my presence or in opposition to me. It can mean either one of those things. You shall have no other gods in my presence, or you shall lift up no other gods in opposition to me. Both of those would be true statements, and the word can mean both of those things. So in my presence or in opposition to me. So that's the command. Again, on the piece of paper, it would say command number 1, no other gods before me. And then underneath it, you have Deuteronomy chapter 12. You have Deuteronomy chapter 12 underneath the first command. I just want to look at some highlights from Deuteronomy chapter 12. We're going to move pretty quickly through this. But look what it says concerning not having any other God, not worshiping, not selecting any other God from this pagan land you're going into. Don't select any other God to worship, because I am the only God. And so we get into Deuteronomy chapter 12, and it says, these are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. Look at what it says in in verse 2. We're under the heading, no other gods. And look what he says, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods. You see? Because I'm the only God. And when you go into the land of Canaan, you find their sacred places and burn them to the ground, destroy them, crush them into powder. Utterly do away with every other worship site in the land, because you will worship me in the place that I select. He hasn't told them yet exactly where they will worship Him, where they will assemble the tabernacle again. But immediately he starts in with the first command in Deuteronomy chapter 12. Utterly destroy all the places where the nations serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars. Why? Because I am the only God, and you shall have no other God before me. You shall tear down their altars. You shall smash their sacred pillars. You shall burn their asherim with fire. And you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods. You see, that's the heading, and underneath it, more commands, more commands. Utterly destroy, tear down, smash. All of those, every command voice in the Hebrew is one of the 613 commands. So underneath, you shall have no other gods. You see in Deuteronomy 12 how that plays out in time. You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God. Don't set up all that garbage for me. I told Moses on Mount Sinai of the tabernacle, of the priesthood of the Levites, of the high priesthood of Moses' brother Aaron, of the garb, the oils, the incense, the table of showbread, the menorah, the Ark of the Covenant. You worship me the way I've told you to worship me, not the way the pagans worship their false gods. Verse 5, but you shall seek the Lord. Who? Only the Lord. Seek Yahweh and only Yahweh. You shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose. That hasn't been determined yet, but God will make clear to them where they're to set up their tabernacle in the land of Canaan, where they are to worship God. Seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes, to establish His name there for His dwelling, and there you shall come. Not the high places, not the altars, not the asherim, not any of these false, idolatrous, pagan worship sites. So Yahweh will not tolerate a partial commitment. no other gods before me. You will be tempted, Israel. You're going into a land filled with false gods, filled with numerous false gods. You'll be tempted to worship something that's not me. Don't do it. I will not tolerate partial commitment. He demands worship to be directed to Him only. Look at this verse. I'm going to say it. It's one of my favorites in the Bible. I've got a pastor friend, I've told you this before, I've got a pastor friend that when you walk out of his office, if I put this verse up, it would be right here on this door. It would be on the other side of that door. It would be the last thing I see when I walk in here to teach God's Bible. And this is what Bruce has on above his door, this verse right here. I am the Lord, that is my name, and I will not give my glory to another, nor praise to graven images. I don't share my glory with anyone, including you, Pastor. So get yourself in the proper mindset and go out there and teach my word for me, not to make a name for yourself, to lift my name up before the people that have come to worship me. There's nobody in this building that's come to worship Rick today. You've come to worship Yahweh, and that's of grave importance to pastors. I love that Bruce Baumgartner has this on his wall. I am the Lord, that is my name, and I will not give my glory to another anything, to another false god, to another false image, to another man, to an animal, to a created thing, to a star, to the heavens, to the sun, because people worship everything and anything. All glory belongs to God. Look down in chapter 12 to verse 27. Skip with me to verse 27. He says, you shall offer your burnt offerings. Remember what he tells them to do? Destroy their altars. What do you do on an altar? You offer a burnt offering to a god. Yahweh says, you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, on the altar of the Lord your God. No other altar. Tear down their garbage. Tear down the falseness of their worship system. You shall worship and bring sacrifice to me for the remission of sins, the temporary covering of sins. You'll do that on my altar and on only my altar, and you shall eat the flesh. So again, not on any other altar to any other god, but only on God's altar, the brazen altar, the Old Testament calls it, shall sacrifice be made to the one true God. Verse 28, then Moses gives a charge. He says, be careful. It's one of the 613 commands. It's in the command voice in the Hebrew. It's an imperative. You, Israel, each one of you, be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, so that it may be well with you and your sons after you forever. And I love this next line, for you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. What is it that we're going to do that is good and right in the sight of the Lord our God? We're going to bring sacrifice at His altar only to Him. We're going to worship only Him and sacrifice only to Him. And when we do that, when we've torn down all the false altars, and we worship and bring sacrifice to God only on the proper Israeli altar, then we will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord. But Moses gives them the choice. He wouldn't command it. If it was going to be automatic, he wouldn't have to command it. But he tells them, you be careful, because you're going into the lion's den. I mean, they're going into just a graveyard, as it were, of false gods everywhere. Death and false gods everywhere. So Moses tells them to be careful. Verse 29 says, when the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations which you were going in to dispossess. So God's going to destroy these people. And when He cuts off these nations and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, again, another charge. Beware that you're not ensnared to follow them, because you will be tempted. You will be tempted to worship their gods. But beware in your own soul, keep yourselves from idols, as John told the church. Little children, guard yourselves from idols. Here we have Moses telling his people, guard yourselves from idolatry, guard yourselves from the worship of false gods. You will want to do this. Don't. Beware that you're not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods. What's the heading? What's the first commandment? You shall have no other gods before me. And Deuteronomy 12 falls under that heading. Don't inquire after their gods and say, how do these nations serve their gods, that I may also do likewise? Even in religious settings, the grass is always greener. It's an oddity of the human soul, of the human mind, that we're always itching to find something new, something different. I don't want to go too far down that road, but here's Israel about to enter the land of Canaan, and Moses, being a wise man, knows you're going to go into that land and you're going to be tempted to worship their gods the way that they worship their gods. Astoundingly, after seeing the 10 plagues, after seeing the Red Sea part, after eating manna for 40 years, drinking water in a desert where there shouldn't be water, after your clothing not having rotted out, worn out on you, after all the miracle and provision of God, you're going to be tempted to go into a land and worship a different God. Astounding heart of man. Moses knows it, and he warns them, don't do it. Don't go into this land and be ensnared by their gods and ask, well, how do y'all do what you do? Remember, I've got to add this, as in my head I picture what pagan worship is like. Pagan worship is exceedingly sexual. Exceedingly sexual. And many of their graven images and their idols that they created to their gods are multi-breasted. It's exceedingly sexual. If you look at these old images, it's pornographic, truly. And already we have in the men of Israel this weakness. Let's just call it what it is. We have this weakness in the men of Israel, and maybe in all men God's ever created, but in context, the men of Israel, we've got a weakness. Remember, they've already been tempted when Balaam came along a few chapters ago. They've already been tempted to go after the women of Moab, yes? And they did it, and 26,000 men died because of that. 26,000 Jews died. And here they're going into a land filled with Canaan gods, false gods, and all these crazy sexual ways to worship God. And some of these people are going to say, hey, I'd like to take a shot at that. Why don't we worship like they worship today? That looks interesting. And the history of Israel is exactly that. As sad as it is, that's how Israel falls into idolatry. Satan knows, listen, Satan knows in the garden, how did he tempt Eve? Look at this fruit. And what did Eve say about the fruit when she saw that it was pleasant to the eyes? You know, he doesn't tempt you with something that's bitter and sour and ugly. He knows exactly what he's doing. And the false gods and the false religions that Satan has propagated on this earth to many people are attractive. They're attractive. And that's why people fall into them. And Moses says, don't fall. I know you men. I know your tendencies. Don't fall to this. Verse 31 says, you shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God. For now listen to this, the depravity of their sexual engagements is only part of it. You shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God. For every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. I just explained to you part of those acts, but it goes even deeper than that. For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. See, there may be somebody who still thinks God isn't fair. This Old Testament God is angry. Why would this Old Testament God go into Canaan and kill all these people? Look who they are. Look what they're doing. It's bad enough that they're not serving the one true God and not having any other gods before Him, but they have stooped so far as to sacrifice. Let's understand what it means. They burn their sons and daughters in the fire. We're not talking about like taking a branding iron. We're talking about killing a child, laying them on an altar to a false god, building a fire around them, and burning their bodies in sacrifice to a god. Sometimes live burnings, sometimes a carcass that's being burned. God never asked man to burn a man, ever. The sacrifices were always animal. They were doves, they were rams, they were goats, they were sheep, they were oxen. They were never human. God never asked another man to sacrifice a human being. But yet the depravity of these people that they're going in to do away with are sacrificing their children. I'm not picking your child to sacrifice. I'm picking my Caleb. And my mind couldn't go there in its darkest moment. That not only would be something to do, but that would please God. That will gain me favor with God, that I kill my son and offer him to a god. Insanity. That's who the Canaanites and Perizzites and Hittites and Jebusites, that's who they are. And that's why God has said, it's time. The iniquity, the sin, the depravity of the Amorites is complete. They will not turn to me. They're set in their way. God knows all things. We don't have to know. But He has decided that it's time for every living person in the land of Canaan to be killed, and for Israel to take what they have. We move into laws arising from the second commandment. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32, things shift. We have a new column. We go from commandment 1 to commandment 2. What is commandment number 2? It's right here on the board. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 and 5, God spoke out the second commandment to Israel. He said, "You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on earth beneath it, or in the water under the earth." Now God gives more explanation in Exodus here. He says, "I'm a spirit and you didn't see me." Basically, how do we know what a spirit looks like? This light being. We don't. We don't have an image in our minds of what spirit looks like. To me, spirit is invisible to my human eye. So God says, you've not seen me. You don't know what I look like. You heard my voice, but you don't know what I look like. So don't make yourself an image, an idol of what you think I look like, because you don't know. No idols. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Again, no partial commitment. He will not tolerate partial commitment. And so these are the verses from Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32 to Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 18. These are laws arising from the second commandment. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32 to Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 18. The second commandment, no images, no idols, no serving, no worshiping and serving other gods. It's not just about the idol, the making of the idol, but it's also don't worship them and don't serve them. So this is what we see in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32. Moses says, "Whatever I command you," see, he starts a new topic here. "Whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it." And in Deuteronomy 13, this is a very interesting passage. This is one you should get in your mind. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, he speaks of prophets that may come or dreamers of dreams. And listen to what he says. If a prophet or a dreamer of dream arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, a miracle. If a prophet arises in Israel, listen, prophets are going to arise in Israel. God is going to teach the Jews through many prophets. You know who they are. Malachi, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Habakkuk, Amos. You know who they are, the prophets. The major prophets, the minor prophets. God's going to speak to Israel through prophets for the next several hundred years. But if a prophet comes along saying that I sent him, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true. So if he's able to perform a miracle before you, and you're willing to follow him because he's done a miracle concerning which he spoke to you, so if it comes true, if he says, I will do this, and he does it and it comes true, but then he makes this statement, let us go after other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them. You see what he's saying? Satan can do miracles. Remember it when Moses was sent into Pharaoh. Remember Moses dropped his staff, it became a snake, and then there were false god worshipers there. They dropped their sticks and they also became snakes. Who made them snakes? Did Yahweh do that, or did Satan give that authority and that power? Satan did. So let me ask you a question. Can Satan turn a dead piece of wood into a snake? What's the answer? He's done it before. So just because a man shows up and does a miracle, that doesn't mean anything. If this man does a miracle and he says, I'm a prophet of God, and he does a miracle, and then he says, let's go chase after other gods, don't buy the lie. So many people are just so engaged mentally by some grand event, by a healing or something, and man, I'll follow that guy off a cliff. Be careful. Moses says, be careful. If that person says, let us go after other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them, look what it says in verse 3, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. Are there false prophets? Yes, is the answer. Satan wants to distort God's truth, and he'll do it any way he can. Will he send false prophets? Yes. Will he send false dreamers of dreams? I had a dream. God told me in a dream to do this. Will Satan send those people? What's Moses saying? Yes, you better believe it. What are we going to do with these people, Israel? You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Interesting. So God will give Satan the authority to do certain things to see where your allegiance lies. Interesting. You can't change your mind. Satan doesn't have control of you. The demons don't have control of us, but God will use them to test. You say, prove it. The book of Job. Let's keep going. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear Him, not the false prophet, not the false dreamer of dreams, not Satan's man, but you shall follow the Lord your God and fear Him, and you shall keep His commandments, listen to His voice, serve Him, and cling to Him. What about that prophet? Look at verse 5. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death. Wait a minute, this is a miracle worker. We've seen this man do miracles in our land. You want us to kill him? God says, yes, that's exactly right. I don't care what power he has from Satan. If he leads you to serve and worship another god, he should be killed. Put him to death because he has counseled rebellion against Yahweh the Lord. who brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to seduce you from the way. To seduce you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from among you. As we're going into the book of Joshua soon, remember that phrase, you shall purge the evil from among you. That's what God is doing. That's why God is killing the people in the land of Canaan. He's given them 400 years of opportunity to believe in Him. They haven't. They've gotten worse and worse to the point to now they're sacrificing their own children to false gods. It's evil. And God says, purge the evil. I don't care if the evil is Gentile pagan or if the evil is Jewish. Purge the evil. The prophet would be a Jew that stands up. The dreamer of dreams would be a Jew. I don't care who it is. Look how much further he goes in verse 6. If your brother... See, now it gets very personal, doesn't it? Now remember, this is for Israel. This isn't teaching the church. This is teaching Israel. But look what he says. If your brother, your mother's son... Make no mistake, this is your blood, your biological brother, the son of your mother. If your brother or your son or your daughter, how much more personal can you get? Not only your mother's kids, but your own kids, or the wife you cherish, the one you chose, or your friend who is as your own soul, your most coveted, closest confidant. And if any one of these people entice you secretly and they say, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your father have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you. We're talking about the Canaanite gods, Baal, Molech. I mean, I could name 10, 20. They're numerous. If anybody entices you and says, let's go serve the Canaanite gods, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end, you shall not yield to him or listen to him. Your eye shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him. Very interesting in the Old Testament. Don't protect this guy. Don't conceal his ideas. Let it be known. Look at verse 9. You shall surely kill him. Not only kill him. Now remember who we're talking about. Your brother, your children, your wife, your friend. Not only shall Israel put this man to death, but your hand shall be first against him to put him to death. You throw the first stone. Wow. I'm the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any graven image of anything and worship it and serve it. What's the penalty for doing it? Death by stoning. He doesn't play around. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and will never again do such a wicked thing among you, if only that were true. If you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments, which I have commanded you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. You shall make no image and worship and serve it. I don't care if a prophet comes to seduce you. I don't care if your brother comes to seduce you. Now, let me ask you a question. Church age. Now this, I'm not preaching to you that this is what we do today. It's not. But have you ever had anybody, I guarantee you don't have to go very far down your family tree, either up it or down it. Have you had anybody in your periphery that has introduced ideas, thoughts, theologies that would seduce you away from the worship of the Lord your God? If we were in Israel 3,500 years ago, your responsibility before God would be to make that man known and to throw the first stone in his execution. That's Israel. That's brutal. But that was the law of God. Look at the last line. I am a jealous God. No partial commitment. No partial commitment. Let's keep going. Laws arising from the third commandment. What's the third commandment? It's right here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. On Mount Sinai, God gives the third commandment to all Israel. You shall not take the name of Yahweh Elohim, the Lord your God, in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. We've talked about what this means before. This section of the law deals with the exclusiveness of the Lord and his worship. What does taking the name of the Lord in vain mean? It means that we are supposed to honor and protect the name of God. We're supposed to honor and protect his name and his character. So what we're not supposed to do is use his name frivolously or in an insincere way. I swear to God it's true. No, don't do that. So why would you bring up God's name, the creator God of the universe who sustains the world by the word of his power? Why would you bring him up to say something is true? Frivolous, insincere, unnecessary. If you're going to mention God, mention his awesomeness, not some silly nonsense. Certainly not some cuss word. But that's what taking the name of the Lord, taking the name of God in vain means. Using his name frivolously or in an insincere purpose. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1 to 21. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1 to 21 covers this section of taking the name of the Lord your God in vain. So that's kind of a hard one to put under a heading, but let me give you a couple of statements. This section of laws, Deuteronomy 14, deals with the exclusiveness of the Lord and his worship as this pertains to Israel's separation from the other nations. We're to honor and protect the name and the character of God, and one of the ways God does that is to make Israel totally distinct from the other nations of the world. In what they eat, in how they worship, in what they wear, what they drink, everything is distinct about Israel. So that's what this section is about, the separation of Israel from the other nations. Don't do what the Canaanites do. Don't eat what the Canaanites eat. Be distinct and set apart in every area of your life. So Deuteronomy chapter 14 is about food primarily. The distinctiveness of the food of Israel. In honoring God and protecting the character of God, we're shown that God is so distinct from everything else, and Israel is to remain distinct also. Look what it says. We'll be here a very short amount of time. Look what it says in verse 2, Deuteronomy 14. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. See, they're sanctified. They're set apart. That's what this word holy means. They're distinct, set apart for the service of God. From all the nations of the world, God calls out Israel to be different and distinct. His own nation, his own people, a kingdom of priests. Nobody else, no other nation gets any language like this, including the good old US of A. We are not in a covenant with God, the United States of America. God never came down and spoke to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington the way he spoke to Abraham, the way he spoke to Moses, the way he entered into covenant with this people, signed a contract with them with the blood of a bull. He didn't do that for America. So it's only Israel. Only Israel has ever entered into contact with the contract or covenant with the living God. No one else has done this. No other nation has ever done this. Ever. No other nation ever will. It's only Israel. In verse 2, you are a holy people, Israel. set apart and sanctified to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you, Israel. This is Israel, not the church. Israel, Israel, Israel. The Lord has chosen you, Israel, to be a people for His own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. There ought to be a big period after that. The Lord your God has chosen Israel to be His own nation out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Not just the people in the land of Canaan, the Egyptians also, that's not the land of Canaan. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, that's not the land of Canaan. But of all the nations in the known world at this time, and I would say in the known world today, of all the nations on the earth, there's only one group of people that God has ever called, chosen to be His own people, and that's Israel. You shall not eat any detestable thing. Why? Because you're holy, you're distinct, you're different. Everybody is to look at your lifestyle and see the distinctiveness of God. Verse 6, any animal that divides the hoof. I go here because I mentioned bacon a lot. I say, how many of you, we're not Israel, how many of you had bacon in the last week? And everybody raises their hand, yeah, bacon. I had bacon this morning. Where do I get that? That's why I'm going into this quickly. Verse 6, any animal that divides the hoof, a split hoof like a pig. Any animal that divides the hoof and has the hoof split in two and chews the cud among the animals that you may eat. A pig does not chew its cud like a cow does. I don't know what other animals chew the cud, but I know a cow does. Sits there and ruminates all day. Chews that cud all day long. Split hoof, chews the cud, kill and eat. But not these other detestable animals. Look at number 7. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those that divide the hoof in two. And these are what you can't eat. The camel, the rabbit, the shafan, that's probably a badger, a rock badger. For though they chew the cud, they do not divide the hoof. They are unclean for you. You think, my goodness, you even care about what we eat? Absolutely. Because you are to be distinct. Now, some people say that there are medicinal reasons for this. That God doesn't let Israel eat certain foods because they would probably make them sick. And I would answer, yeah, that's probably right. He's a God that takes care of His people. But there's more to it than just medicinal reasons. There's this distinctiveness. And in verse 8, and we get out of this quickly, the pig. Among the things that Israel was not to eat, the pig, because it divides the hoof. You've seen pig trails, because it divides the hoof but does not chew its cud. It is unclean for you. So you shall not eat any of their flesh, nor even touch their carcasses. So that's why when I mention bacon, this is the verse, and from other places in Leviticus where I get that. An observant Jew, a good Jew, if you know any Jews, and you go take them out to Denny's and they order bacon, wrong. Can't do that. But they could if they were Christian, if they understood the age in which we live, the freedom in Christ. To kill and eat, rise, Peter, kill and eat, to eat all things. But Israel was not to eat a pig, any part of a pig. No ham, no bacon, no anything else that comes out of a pig, no tenderloin, no nothing. They were to be distinct. Laws arising from the fourth commandment. Let's finish this. The fourth commandment. What is the fourth commandment? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, recently, in the last 2 weeks, in the second hour, we've gone through the 9 commandments of the 10 commandments that are repeated in the New Testament that the church is supposed to obey. We do not obey Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 was not written to the church. Exodus chapter 20, where you find the 10 commandments, is written to Israel, not to the church. But 9 of these commands that we're looking at today are repeated in the New Testament for us. So we obey them. And not to get too far off of track here, but has it ever been okay for a man to murder someone, or did it just become law on Mount Sinai with Moses in 1500 AD, BC? Was it always wrong to kill someone? Was it always wrong to commit adultery? Was it always wrong to steal? I take you back to the early pages of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 4, when Cain killed Abel, was there a punishment for that? Or was it, no big deal, that's fine, do whatever you want to? Was there a punishment for Cain killing Abel? Of course there was. God levied that punishment, not man. They were under the age of conscience, the dispensation of conscience, and so God was the judge and the jury. After Noah got off the boat, who became the judge and the jury? Man did. And if a man is a murderer by another man, that murderer shall die. But before that, it's always been wrong. There are universal, eternal laws that were wrong in the garden with Adam and Eve that are reiterated in the Mosaic law. It's always been wrong to covet. It's always been wrong. And we could go back and look at some of that stuff one of these days, but let's move forward. The laws arising from the fourth commandment, where do you find them? These are the verses. Deuteronomy 14, verse 22, all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 17. So Deuteronomy 14, 22 to Deuteronomy 16, verse 17. These are the Jewish laws that go under the heading of keeping the Sabbath day and keeping it distinct and holy and set apart. You may look in these verses and say, I just don't really see that. Well, let me make a statement to you. Nations of the world in this period of time when Israel is living, nations in this period of time would show their gratitude to their gods. They would show their gratitude, their loyalty, and worship to their gods by bringing Him offerings. What did we just read about? The Canaanite, these pagans in Canaanite land were bringing offerings to their gods. They were worshiping their gods through offerings, even offering their own children in fire, sacrificing their own children. So at this time, this period of time, 1500 BC or so, the nations of the world showed their gratitude, their loyalty, and their worship to their false gods by bringing Him offerings. And that's what this section is about. This section focuses on offerings to Yahweh, the one true God. Because in the time period, that's how they worshiped their God. That's how they kept their worship holy. So this section focuses on offerings to Yahweh. Let's look at it. Skip all the way down to verse 22, Deuteronomy 14, 22. Offerings. You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. Also in verse 27, skip your eyes down to verse 27. See, we're talking about offerings to God. The tithe is to God. Don't get hung up on the 10% idea. The idea is take from what God gives you and give back. Offer it to the God who gave it to you. Verse 27, you shall not neglect the Levite, the priest, the worship leader. You shall not neglect the Levite who's in your town, for he has no portion or inheritance among you. The Levites are to take their portion from the people, from the other Jews. So what is God saying? Honor me by honoring my servants. Honor me by honoring my servants. Yahweh was the possessor of the land. He's the owner of the land, and He provided from His land for His servants, the Levites. So give them what they need to be sustained. I provided everything. And don't forget my servants, the Levites. The Levites would receive their sustenance from the bounty of the land. So let's keep going. All Israel was to tithe, and this is 10%. All Israel was to tithe every year of their harvest. We're talking about what grows, the produce of the field, And look at verse 28. Every third year there was an additional tithe. Not a different tithe, an additional tithe. So instead of 10% to the tabernacle and the service of the Levites, every third year they had to give 20%. Verse 28 says, at the end of every third year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year and shall deposit it in your town. This extra tithe was for a festival. Deposit all this extra produce in your town. Look what it says in verse 29. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the alien, the foreigner, the non-Jew, and the orphan, the child who has no mom and dad, and the widow who are in your town shall all come together and eat and be satisfied. See, I love that God produces, God gives this production of the land, and every third year, come and remember that I've given it to you. Everybody come together. Bring all the produce of your field and let's have a feast. Let's enjoy the bounty of God together. I think we just did that. What do we call it in America? Thanksgiving. Not every third year, but every, fourth Thursday in November? That's exactly what we just did. We each brought from our bounty, from what God's given us. We brought it to a central table. A lot of us invited people that aren't family into our homes to share this meal with us. I love the picture here of Thanksgiving in Israel. Wouldn't have been called that. It's what we call an idea like this. So the Levite, the alien, the orphan, the widow shall all come and eat and be satisfied in order that, why? Why this festival? In order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So divine blessedness and rejoicing before the Lord are in view here. The blessedness that God gives Israel and rejoicing before the Lord. Would have been a great time of Thanksgiving every third year in Israel. The joy in the farms as they're plowing and they're getting ready for this great gathering in all their cities. All throughout Israel, in all the towns of Israel, there would have been this great feast. It would have been a great celebration. It wasn't just for the Jews. Again, notice the aliens, the Gentiles who lived among Israel. Everybody is fed by Yahweh during this time. In Deuteronomy 15, verse 1, continuing on this offering idea, at the end of every 7 years, I'm bringing some of this up because you've heard of it, and I just want you to know where it is in the Bible. At the end of 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts. So every 7 years in Israel, if you owed your brother 100 shekels, it wasn't shekels, whatever it would have been then, the debt was either canceled. Now there's some debate as to whether this was a complete canceling of that debt or whether I just didn't have to pay you back during this year like the debt was postponed during this year. Now which it is, the rabbis fight about, the Jewish rabbis, so we're not going to pick a side. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is there was a remission of debt during the 7th year. Whether when the 8th year began you had to start paying it back again, God knows and I don't, and it doesn't matter. Like I say, even the Jews who've studied this for thousands of years can't decide where they land. But the remission of debt every 7th year, the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year. In verse 4 it says, however, there will be no poor among you. I just want you to see a difference in verse 4 and verse 11. Sometimes you read the Bible and you say, this book has problems. This book has problems. But it doesn't. Look at what it says in verse 4. However, there will be no poor among you. How many poor people will there be in Israel according to verse 4? Read no further. How many? 0. Since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. But look what it says in verse 5. If only you will listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God. So that idea of there being no poor among you has a caveat. You have to obey the Lord in order for that to be true. Observe carefully all His commandments. Look down at verse 11. Read verse 4 again. There will be no poor among you if you listen obediently. In verse 11, Moses says, for the poor will never cease to be in the land. Can you see the problem? If you're just reading it and you think, well, what does that mean? You just said there will be no poor, and now you say there's always going to be poor. You can't get any more polar opposite than that. You might think the Bible has an inconsistency in it. It doesn't, because of what verse 5 says. If you will listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God and observe carefully all His commandments, which I am commanding you today, then there will be no poor in the land. But since you will not, the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you. So what does he say concerning the poor? In offerings to God again, freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy, and the poor in your land. If you read in this section, you'll see where he talks about having an evil eye and a generous eye. An evil eye is a stingy man who gathers and says, it's all mine, I won't share. And someone with a good eye is someone who's generous and gives according to the law of God. Freely open your hand to your brother. In verse 6 or chapter 16, just so you can see it, because I mentioned this a lot also, and we'll stop here. In chapter 16, verse 1, observances, offerings to God, feast days. You shall observe the month of Aviv, and celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God. In verse 3, he says, you shall not eat leavened bread. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, so that you may remember all the days of your life when you came out of the land of Egypt. There's a feast of Passover, and at the same time there's a feast of unleavened bread. Verse 6 says, but at the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish His name, remember that's yet as yet to happen, there you shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset. Look what it says in verse 10. I'm just showing you the feast days in the book of Deuteronomy. Then you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks. What do the Greeks call this? Pentecost. Pentecost, the 50 days, the Feast of Weeks. Count 7 weeks. 7 weeks, and the day after, on the 50th day, is to be Pentecost. That's where they get Pentecost from, 50. Penta means 50. You shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord with the tribute of a freewill offering in your hand. See, it's about offerings to this God. Look at verse 13. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths. This is also called Tabernacles. This is a fall celebration. The 7 days after you've gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. Look what it says at the end of verse 15. It says, 7 days you shall celebrate a feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful. See how wonderful it was to be with Israel? Israel's relationship with Yahweh was to be wonderful, joyful, rejoicing. Every third year, a huge town celebration. They didn't live like that. And in verse 16, this is what I want to get to. We stop right here. 3 times in a year, I mentioned this a lot. 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which He chooses. Ultimately, we know that that is the city of Jerusalem. And He names the 3 times a year that every Jewish man has to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's also Passover. They're 2 different feasts, but they take place at the same time. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, 50 days later, and then in the fall, several months later, at the Feast of Booths. So 3 times every Jew would have to come into Jerusalem. Let me ask you this. If Jesus lived 33 years, and He did, and He perfectly fulfilled the law, and He did, how many times did His father Joseph go into Jerusalem, or Jesus go into Jerusalem? That's kind of a trick question. It's hard to know when he started because it's for the fathers. But in his adult ministry, Jesus Christ from age 30 to 33 would have been in Jerusalem at least 9 times. Because he's an observant Jew, and 3 times a year, every Jew has to go to Jerusalem, every Jewish male, according to Deuteronomy right here, chapter 16, verse 16. Jesus was in and out of Jerusalem. I used to think for some reason Jesus went to Jerusalem one time, the week he was sacrificed. And then I started reading the Bible and realized, okay, I don't know where you got that from, but that's nonsense. We have these strange views of things sometimes, just because we don't read the Bible and see what the truth is. He would have been in Jerusalem often. We read about in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, maybe just a few visits. I'm telling you right now that Jesus, who never disobeyed the law even one time in all his life, would have been in Jerusalem at least 9 times for each of these feast days. Probably many, many, many more than that. Let's close in prayer. Father,